Hi, thank you so much for inviting me to give this presentation, and I hope you find it useful. For those of you that don't know me, my name is Nish, and I'm a debater at the University of Edinburgh, and my presentation is going to focus on giving feedback as an adjudicator. So how can judges give oral adjudications and constructive criticisms that are genuinely useful to teams in understanding how the debate played out, and also what they could have done better going into future debates, rather than just the one that they've experienced. So hopefully you find it useful. Okay, so this presentation is going to focus on broadly 4 sections. I think the first thing that I want to go over is what should an adjudicator be trying to do, because actually the first step to giving good adjudications at the end of the debate is going into the debate with the right frame of mind. So the first step is going to be to understand your objectives as an adjudicator. Secondly, we're going to talk about strategies to help you give good feedback during the debate itself. So how can you take notes effectively? Then thirdly, how you should structure that feedback to get across the most important information. Obviously, when you're judging, you have very limited time. And then finally, what sort of things should you emphasize with your feedback? So let's go straight into it. What are our objectives as an adjudicator? I think that people don't think about adjudicating very much, or they don't think about what goal they're trying to achieve very much. But ultimately, you have 3 purposes, and I don't think that it's just the simple purpose of working out who won the debate. I think the first thing you have is a responsibility towards the competition to come to a decision in which the best performing debaters are rewarded with the most points. So the teams that win the debate also get an adjudication in which they win in the rankings. That's kind of obvious, and I don't think people forget about that one very much, but I do think they forget about the other 2 objectives that I think judges should bear in mind. So the second objective is a responsibility that you have as an adjudicator towards the teams in your debate. You want to help them understand the results that they have received and also work out how they can get a better result next time. And then finally, you have a responsibility towards yourself, because judging is and should be just as competitive as speaking is, and so you want to do well and achieve a good result. If you're a panelist, this means you want to be able to contribute productively to the discussion. If you're a chair, it means you need to be able to handle the discussion well and also provide useful oral adjudications to the teams. So this presentation is going to focus primarily upon these second 2, how judges can help teams achieve better results next time, and also how they can provide those useful oral adjudications. But I think it's important that we also have some understanding of how the best performing debaters in your round understand the results that they have achieved. So I think it's also important that we have some understanding of how the best performing debaters in your round understand the results that you are giving them. So ultimately, as an adjudicator who's giving feedback, you can kind of reframe your objectives to the following. Step 1, we want to be making sure that we're evaluating the debate clearly and fairly. We want to be specific. We want to make sure we're giving everybody the best opportunity to win. Secondly, we want to explain that reasoning as thoroughly as we can, and we want to do it in a way that is as easy as possible for the teams to understand. So it's really important that teams understand how their arguments interacted with every other team in the debate, and expressing that can be just as difficult as giving a debate speech. But ultimately, that's part of the objective that chairs have to take on and part of their responsibility. And then finally, when you're giving them feedback, that feedback should, yes, be applicable to the debate that just happened, but more importantly, you should try to identify strategic errors that teams are making or persistent deficits that you've identified, so that teams can take your feedback and apply it to a debate on a whole other topic. So although you might watch one debate that's on, say, the economy, if you notice that a team is frequently failing to respond thoroughly to another team, that's important feedback, because that's going to be applicable even in the next debate on politics. Telling a team that they didn't know how to express clearly the way the job market works is going to be useful for the next debate they have on the economy, but actually it's not as useful as the broader strategic identification. So really, one of the hardest pivots to make mentally as a judge is to start thinking about the game of debating as well as just the topic you're evaluating. And it's your job to help guide the debaters that are in your room to do better at the game as well as just better at the topic that you've seen. So, having thought about what our objectives are, how can we make our note-taking more effective and more efficient? Well, there's a number of things that we need to do here. So as we said before, this is about evaluating a debate clearly and fairly, because ultimately that's what you'll need. That's the kind of raw material you'll need to be able to give a good oral adjudication. And I think the first step to this, to giving a good result as a judge, is effective note-taking. Now, every judge is going to have their own preferences for how they take notes. I know some judges take notes on a different sheet of paper for each team. Some judges prefer to fold a piece of paper in half so they can directly compare one side to the other. That is always going to be individual. And, you know, if you look at the screen now, you'll see how I take my own notes. And I like taking all of my notes on a single A4 sheet of paper. I write in tiny, tiny little letters. And that's something that works for me and might not work for another judge. So this obviously has to be very, very individual. But I do think there are some important things you can do as a note taker. So the first thing is you need to be communicating to yourself as you're going along. So although this might be, you know, a lot of small writing, I just want to highlight a few things here. You'll notice at times I write things like IMP, ? IMP, that's short for importance. So I'm asking myself the question, why is this important? Or at another time, if I think that an argument finally resolves an uncertainty that's been going back and forth between the debate, I give it a little tick at the end. So I know that when I see that argument, I can say, aha, this is resolving something that as a judge, I was unsure about. And finally, you need to be writing comments to yourself. So if you look in the purple circle, you can see I've written, but why does this mean Russia cannot be appealed to? And all of these things are important because they mean that you can, when it comes to the adjudication, you can ask yourself the relevant questions. So now instantly you can focus on the few things that are really going to be determinative in the debate rather than getting lost in all of your notes. One thing I would caution against, and this is something that a lot of judges do adopt, is only writing down things that are new or relevant or additional. The reason I would caution against that is that it firstly means that you will forget those things that are irrelevant, but that the teams think are relevant. So when you give feedback, teams are more likely to think that you're ignoring something of relevance that they have said. Secondly, you will not always be able to judge what is relevant at the start of the, I guess, chain of analysis or the start of that paragraph of the speech. And so if you preemptively decide not to write something down and it's only later that you realize, oh, this is relevant, you're already missing a lot of analysis that was provided. And so I think that makes your case less specific. My advice, and again, this is a personal preference, but my advice is write down as much as is said, even if it's repetitive, and then just note it is repetitive, or this is not important, or this doesn't make sense yet. Because that way, at least you can give the teams that feedback. And I think that's something that they will ultimately appreciate a lot more. So as well as this, I think it's important that we take feedback on the relevant part of a debate. And I think all arguments have the same underlying logic to them. So I've put it up on this slide here. This is actually not that relevant to judging as a whole, but I think it's important to note that kind of all teams in all debates are trying to do one of two things. Either they're supporting a policy, in which case they have to prove that the action is legitimate, so it's morally permissible, that there's a responsibility to act in this case or to achieve some goal, that the action will be effective in achieving an outcome, that the outcome is desirable, and that it's sufficiently desirable to outweigh the alternatives. And actually, regardless of whether you're talking about legalizing prostitution or invading Syria, those are the underlying themes that any argument has to have. And they're, you know, in 5 or 6 years of competitive debating now, I've never actually found any additional steps to this. As long as you have these 5s in sufficient amount of depth, you are covering pretty much everything. Motions which are about a belief, so this house regrets, this house believes that, are a little bit simpler because the question has been limited for you, but essentially you have a statement, so this house believes that it is immoral too, and you need to set up some criteria for which the statement is fulfilled. And then secondly, you need to demonstrate that the particular case is fulfilling of that criteria, and then finally that any evidence against this is outweighed by evidence for it. So again, that evaluation at the end. Now, the reason that it's important to, as a judge, know these steps, and I do think this is one of those times where being a better judge and being a better debater feed into each other, is that if you are already thinking of an argument in these terms, starting with whether it is proven to be legitimate, whether it is proven that there should be an action here, whether that action is going to be effective, it means that you also know which arguments beat each other more efficiently. You know where those logical gaps are. Because we often say to teams as judges, oh, I thought that it lacked analysis, or I thought that it didn't convince me. But that's incredibly vague language, and I think it's unfair to give teams feedback like that. If you know that this argument requires these 5 steps, and then you can identify that some of these steps are missing or insufficiently explained, that then means you can provide teams feedback that is more structured and more relevant to the argument at hand. So bearing this framework, the underlying logic of an argument in mind, you can then note down when those steps are missing, and that's exactly what your job as a judge is. But there's also a hierarchy of analytical strength. So when we're working out whether something is analyzed, we essentially want to know whether something is likely or whether something is unlikely, and whether something is explained or whether something is less well explained. So what I mean by this is, if you look at this graph here, essentially an argument that seems very, very likely needs less explanation for you to credit it. So if I were to say something like global warming is real, or climate change is real, and it's likely that there's going to be increased pressures on the environment in the next 50 years, I don't need to explain the exact vagaries of why climate change is real, because that seems very likely and the average person would know it is likely. And an argument that is very implausible or unlikely, but that is explained with a lot of steps of analysis, it comes close to a proof, that is also a strong argument. And so you have to compensate for one with the other. And I think at each stage, your job as a judge is to look at how many steps of analysis there are, and then to look at the plausibility of the argument. And the plausibility of the argument can be supported too. It's supported by examples that say, okay, but in a lot of cases, this person has reacted negatively to globalization. So it is likely that in this hypothetical case, they also would react negatively to globalization. That's the kind of support you can provide for likelihood, and you can also provide analysis for how that action would come about. This person has adopted a framework in which they seem to behave irrationally because they're primarily defensive. That defensiveness extends to their territoriality. Globalization challenges their dominance, therefore they will react negatively in parliament. I don't know, whatever the analysis is. It's not going to be the same in every case, but the point is that you should be looking at this framework of giving strength. So the 2 last steps that I talked about, the logical steps underlying any argument, and then this kind of chart of what makes an argument better analyzed versus less well analyzed, which is explanation and likelihood, those can then be used to help arguments interact with one another. So the way that you should be taking notes well is with this framework in mind. Was it important? Were you left unsure what the scale of the impact is so that you don't know whether it outweighs other arguments? How does this argument interact with other arguments within the debate? And so on. You always want to be taking notes with this in mind and taking notes during the debate, because that's the only way in which you can be specific giving feedback. And where you consistently identify a gap in a speaker's performance or in a team's performance. So for example, if they don't do that comparison and explain why one claim is more true than the contrary claim, and this happens for maybe 2 or 3 of the sub-arguments within their speech, then that's something you've now identified as being a general weakness with the speaker's strategy, and that's the really important feedback you can give them that they can take onwards into a future debate. So having that general constructive point of feedback is only really possible if you're analyzing the arguments they're presenting to you from this kind of almost meta-debating framework where you're looking at what the underlying logic of a debate ought to contain. Okay, so next I want to talk about how feedback ought to be structured. So people have, again, a lot of different preferences about this. The one that's the most common is starting with the team that placed first, and then the team that placed second, third, and fourth. This is useful in some ways. So it's useful because you always cover the comparisons the teams themselves are most invested in. And you always care as a speaker about why you beat a team and lost to another team. And so that comparison is always explicitly addressed with this method, but I think it has some weaknesses. So one weakness is that it firstly underlies the assumption that if the team that ranked first beat the team that ranked second, and the team that ranked second beat the team that ranked third, the team that ranked first must beat the team that ranked third without any additional explanation. I don't necessarily think that that's true. It can be true sometimes. So if team 2 was not responsive and team 3 was also not responsive, then team 1 has beaten teams 2 and 3 for the same reasons. But sometimes team 3 is responsive and team 1 and team 2 still beat them. So I actually think it's much more useful to go through the debate chronologically. So this has a bunch of advantages. The first advantage, and I think the most important one, and it's so important that I always say it at the start of every adjudication, is that the participant knows exactly what was said at each stage and what was left standing at the point that they stood up to speak. And this is important because as a speaker, you have to judge what's happening dynamically. The debate is changing and you have to make that judgment in the moment. And so if you're only giving people feedback from the perspective of the end of the debate, you're not necessarily helping them understand in the way that they're going to be thinking in future debates. In future debates, they're not going to be judges sitting at the end, looking at their notes of all 8 speeches and then deciding what to say. They are going to be in the same position they were now, which is, okay, I'm the second speaker in this debate, what should I be doing? And so giving them feedback that is tailored to that is much stronger in my opinion, because it means that they are always receiving the kind of tailored thinking that they will then be able to apply. I think the second thing is, it also incentivizes you to judge each team on its own merits, as well as judging them relative to each other team. So you're not just focusing on the things that eventually decided it one way or another, you're also focusing on the things that are presented at each point. And you have to say, well, okay, so team 3 presented these things, and they were strong for these reasons, or they were weak for these reasons, and now we can discuss how they were comparing to other teams in terms of their analytical strength. So the final advantage that this method has, and from like the selfish perspective of the judge, I think this is maybe one of the most important ones, is that you can do a lot of the work during the debate itself. So if you kind of look at this chart, this is kind of how I think about it. During the first team speeches, you can't compare them to any other team because no other team has spoken yet. But you can assess the OG, you can assess their individual strengths, what was good, what wasn't good, what was missing, what questions were left in your head. And so when the OO speaks, you can assess the OO, but because you've already done a lot of the judgment about the OG, you can start doing the comparison there and then. And you can work out what you think about the OG versus the OO and why. And so the closing government team, yes, you assess them, but also you already have some idea of whether the OG or the OO has won. So you can work out whether the CG beats whichever team has won in the top half. And if not, you can work out whether they beat the other team or not. And that comparison means that you are already starting to form a tentative ranking of the 3 teams. And then when the CO come up and then they give their speech, you can then slot them in with each of the others. By the time that the CG assessment happens or the CO assessment happens, the other teams have already been thought about twice or 3 times at this point. And so it becomes much easier for you to really distill what the strengths of each debate was in order to come to that assessment. And so by the time that the actual adjudication starts, you're now no longer assessing them from scratch, looking over your notes for the first time. You're actually looking over your notes to make sure you haven't missed anything, to turn what is a preliminary judgment into one that is watertight, that really is well justified, and that hasn't got any presumptions or missing links on your part. And it also means that the discussion then becomes much more productive, because now you have 15 whole minutes that you can spend discussing other perspectives with other wings to make sure you haven't missed anything, coming up with useful feedback that they can apply and take into future rounds, and also making sure that you are thinking about how you might structure your own adjudication and oral adjudication when you have to present it back to the teams. And so in this way, I think minimizing effort requires thinking smart about the debate, and this is in my opinion, the easiest way to do it. Judge as the debate is going on. And then, since we're already kind of thinking about giving the feedback chronologically for the reasons that I discussed earlier, you already have a framework that you can use to give that adjudication based on how you have been thinking about the adjudication. So now you don't have to reorder the way you've been thinking to fit the ranking you eventually came to. You still present the adjudication the same way you thought about it, and then you can explain one by one how that ranking was eventually arrived at. And I think that's one of the, if people are ever complimentary about my judging, I'm obviously very grateful for that compliment. But I think the only thing that I consistently do very differently from other judges is go through debates in this way. Judge the debate as it's going on, deliver that adjudication chronologically, and make sure I'm assessing each team individually. This way, you're always going to give all 6 comparisons. You start by saying, okay, so the opening government team said this, this, and this. I thought this was strong, but this was missing these steps. And then opening opposition said this, this, and this. They were also missing these steps, but I think that the way they interacted with OG was thus. So you've done OG and OO and the OG-OO comparison. Then you can do CG, the CG-OO comparison, the CG-OG comparison, and then you can do CO, the CO-CG comparison, the CO-OO comparison, and the CO-OG comparison. And that way, you've done all 6 comparisons, discussed all 4 teams, and without having to waste a lot of time. So I think that this really streamlines the way that adjudications go and makes them more useful. And you don't fall into the same traps that I think people fall into when they give adjudications simply ranking teams from 1st to 4th and doing those comparisons. So what should that feedback contain? I think that the feedback should contain which arguments were evaluable and which arguments were judgment calls. So what I mean by this is, if a team quantifies an argument somehow, they say this affects this many people, or it harms them to a great degree, or it is mitigated by these other factors, which means it's not as bad as the opposing team suggests. Those are all metrics that they're providing you, or hints that they're providing you with, for how much you should value one argument versus another. Where the team provides that, that becomes evaluable, and as a judge, you have something concrete that isn't your own assessment, but is actually an argument the teams have provided to compare. And where things are evaluable, I think you should always start by saying, we were able to compare these claims from both sides, and this team won or this team didn't win. And sometimes it's okay to say, actually, we thought that they were relatively similarly analyzed in size, and they seemed to be relatively similar in impact. So we left them as equal. It's also important to explain which things are judgment calls, because if you're in a room where all the teams are very experienced, you're lucky enough to have those comparisons made for you. But if a team doesn't do that, then that's when judges have to make comparisons for themselves. And you should try to be as fair about this as possible. So a team might not say that an argument affects a lot of people, but if you intuitively and obviously know it affects a lot of people, I think you can give it implicit credit ahead of an equally analyzed argument that only affects a few people, if neither team has done that for you. That's a judgment call that requires a very small amount of your own input as an adjudicator, and you should always be minimizing the amount of input you're providing, because otherwise you are debating against the teams rather than assessing how the teams have debated against each other. I think that there is another thing I want to say here, and this is a really personal preference, but it's okay to be honest when you're unsure about decisions or when you think there are doubts about those decisions. A lot of the times, judges come to a decision and they think that they have to defend it to the hilt. They have to make it seem completely watertight in order to escape criticism. That's not true, and I think that it's much more important that you tell teams when you weren't really convinced conclusively to put one team above another, but had to put one team above another, and you came to that judgment the best that you could. The reason for this is that part of a team's job is to remove that ambiguity. And if a team is deliberately leaving things ambiguous, that is indicative of a failure on behalf of one team or another to debate at the highest level they can. And if you're not telling them when that happens, then you're not providing them with room for improvement or areas for improvement. And I think that teams actually respect that a lot more than the alternative, which is where they themselves feel like they might have won and then they get told that it was conclusively a loss for them. I think it's just much more important to be honest. And that is a really good practice even when a team does win, because although you should always be able to justify your decision, you should also be honest when that justification is more judgmental, more subjective, and when that justification is more objective. It's based on things that are said in the debate. The next thing is, if possible, offer suggestions or improvements that teams can do going into the future. Try to do this for all of the teams, because it also means that people who lose don't feel bad about themselves because they're the only one receiving tips for improvement. And I think that's the sort of thing that, in general, prevents debaters from becoming arrogant and cocky, but also is very useful for providing good input in terms of improving in debating as a whole. So, for example, if you're an intermediate level team, for example, you're probably going to do well in your first debate. You're probably going to win, or you might come second because it's completely randomly matched. If a judge isn't giving you room for improvement, even in debates that you won, that's one fewer debate out of 5 or 6 that you're not getting feedback for. And that's only if every single debate is providing you an oral adjudication. Most tournaments, if they have 5 rounds, there are only 3 rounds where they give you that oral feedback. And if in the first round you're not being given ways you can improve, then that's a third of your opportunity to improve being taken away. So I think it's really important that you try to provide tips for each team. It should not come into the adjudication that a team didn't say something you might have said if you were in the debate. And I think it's important to emphasize that teams aren't being penalized for this so that they don't get the wrong impression. But nonetheless, saying in another debate, this might have been a way in which you could improve, or this might have been a thing to spend more time focusing on, is really useful feedback. And I know I appreciated it a lot as a speaker, and I think that a lot of the best speakers will tell you they love getting feedback, and giving them that feedback, even when they're doing well, is super, super important. The final thing is, make your feedback as specific as you can. Whenever a team gets vague feedback, it is basically useless to them. Every team knows they need to be more responsive, be more analytical. What is more helpful is when you can pinpoint when exactly they were or they were not. And I think that a good rule of thumb here is that for each team, your oral adjudication should use as many of the words that they used in their speech as possible. Because that way you're always relating it directly to something that they said, and you're always relaying that idea using their own words, so you know they're going to be able to understand what you're talking about, and they're going to be able to relate it to their own thinking. And so providing those specific examples and that specific analysis is really, really useful for making sure that teams understand exactly what caused them to do well or not well. And I think teams value thorough adjudications, I think teams value constructive adjudications, and I think teams value specific adjudications. Those are like my top 3 tips: is thorough, specific, and constructive. And if you can do that, I think you're already going to do phenomenally as an adjudicator. The final thing I want to talk about is just a few tips to kind of remember, and some traps you might avoid. So the first is be wary of biases. One thing that I've noticed a lot when observing my wings or other judges is that people fall into reputation traps. So if they know a team is very renowned, or they know a team is a big name, they implicitly give it more credit than another team. And I think that that's really unfair, because it means that you have to be famous in order to do well, rather than trying hard and putting in effort and talent. And so always try and make sure that you're able to justify specifically why arguments are ranked above other ones. And if you're the chair judge and you suspect a wing might be doing this, I think the easiest and most useful way to analyze that and unpack that is to just ask them why, and keep pushing them to justify it, because it might be that they're correct and that is the team that has done well, but they need to be able to provide that justification. And I think that that's really important. As well as reputation, other biases exist too. So we have a really big body of work that tells us that we value certain styles of debating versus other styles more highly, that we value, for example, fluency, or that we value masculine traits more highly than others. So just be wary of those and make sure that your decision is justifiable completely separately from any of those factors. And so the more justification you can provide, the less likely it is that you're going to fall into this trap. Speaker scores are a really important part of judging, and I think that they're the ones that people get they're the ones that people find hard to get used to awarding. One of the reasons for that is that you don't often have a lot of time left. So I think that the things I talked about earlier, making your judging and your discussion more efficient, will help free up time to actually award speaker scores properly. But the other thing that can waste too much time is trying, incredibly precisely to assign things to the speaker scale that you're provided. You should always be assigning things correctly on the speaker scale, but it's also going to be subjective and you can't ever do it perfectly. So what I find is the most useful, where you have time, is to start by getting the panel to agree on who the best speaker in the debate was, which isn't always the speaker on the winning team, but agree on who the best individual speaker was, and using the scale, award them a score, and then find the speaker that was the worst in the debate, and using the scale, award them a score. Now, by kind of logic, everybody else must be between those two people, and so now, when you're assessing where to put them on the scale, it becomes much easier because you're only putting them on a scale that is a few points apart rather than the 50-point scale you're presented. So that's just a tip that I find helps award more logically consistent speaker scores, but also ones that help saves time rather than leaving them to be quite random. And then finally, keep your feedback focused on the analytical side of arguments. So what I mean by this is, obviously there is an element to coherence and persuasiveness that is dependent upon style, structure, emotion, and so on. But these are things that it is quite hard to give criticism on without being a little bit condescending, I think. And after all, there's no single correct way to give a speech. So as long as you focus primarily on the analysis and those things that are objective, the speaker to whom you're giving feedback is more likely to take that feedback on board. And also, those points of feedback often naturally lead to people fixing those problems with their structure or those problems with their style, since they naturally require you to clearly and slowly break down arguments in order to do better. So for your analysis to improve, you have to have a better structure. You have to make your arguments more clear and specific, which will naturally help your style. But giving that sort of feedback is great because then it means that people achieve a better structure and they achieve a better style, but they don't do it trying to force themselves to fit into a specific box of what a good structure should look like. Rather, they do it based on what works well for them and what their own style and preference is.
What I do want to say here is that debating should not be homogeneous. It should not be robotic. And your job as an adjudicator is to help people become the best that they can be while still expressing their own personality. So I hope you've enjoyed this presentation. I've put my contact details up on the screen, so hopefully you can get in contact with me if you have any questions. Otherwise, I just want to say that I'm really sorry I can't be there in person. It looks like it's going to be an amazing tournament, so I want to say best of luck to all of you, and I'm sure I'll get to see you soon. Bezos, everyone. Thank you so much for listening.